I was listening a few weeks ago to an interview with a former Navy pilot and Top Gun instructor about what he called a 00 landing. That is a landing with absolutely zero visibility in any direction. I want to talk to you about that today. So let me set the scene for you. Flying at night over the Sea of Japan on a routine flight. I can't remember whether it was an F-18 or an F-22. Either way, he's 18 miles from the aircraft carrier. If I did my math right, he's going over 300 miles an hour. He's approaching for a landing when he hears a call over the radio. 99, taxi lights on. Now, if you're like me, you have no idea what that means, but apparently this is the most dreaded call in all of naval aviation. His call sign is 203, but they radioed 99, which means every available aircraft. Taxi lights on means turn all your lights on because we can't see you. In other words, the weather is so bad that there's zero visibility from the carrier and they can't see any aircraft at all whatsoever. In this case, it's a thick snowstorm. Everything as he flies in all directions is black. The only thing he can see other than the glow of his lights, because now he has them all on, are white streaks periodically flying by as clumps of snow break off the nose of the plane and over the cockpit. There is no place to divert. There is no other airport. There's no other landing strip. They're in the middle of the sea. It's the carrier or nothing. The landing must be done purely by instrument and radio communication. At 3 miles out, it's time for final descent. He's trained well. So even though there's still no visual, he goes into position as if it's a normal approach. Locks in his altitude begins to drop. The alarm goes off at 450 feet, even though he still can't see the ocean below him. At 3/4 of a mile, approximately 18 seconds from landing, the control room inside the ship, which is below deck, they can't actually see him, but they can on the radar, says 203, call the ball, which is asking for confirmation if he can see where he's supposed to hit the landing deck. You see, on the carrier, a jet hits a certain spot and it's got a hook that hangs down and snags a cable that slows it down so that it doesn't need the whole runway to land. His response, 203, Clara, which means, I can't see the deck. I can't see anything. Control answers, 203, keep it coming. Meaning they can't see him either, but they want him to continue the approach. So now, this is like 10 seconds. Finally, control room radios 203, paddles contact, which means we finally have visual on you. Right for lineup. Power. This means the alignment is good, but you are dangerously low. Give it some power before you run into the back of the ship. Too high, of course, and you'll go above the hook. Too low, and you will literally crash into the back of the ship. So on instinct, when he hears the word power, he slams the throttle up. Hard to rise. Bam! Tug. He's done. He can't see anything, but now he's on board. All because he followed his training and listened to the control room. And at this point, the interviewer says the following, this sounds like a faith-based operation. And that's when I knew that this would be a great story to drive home this message that I want to bring you today, because at some point in all of our lives, it feels like we are flying blind. We are trying to land 00. Try as we might, we struggle to see what's going on around us, and the correct path forward. But just like this pilot, we have faith, or we need to have faith, that if we follow our training, if we use the tools in our instrument panel that we've been given, and if we listen to direction from the control room, our heavenly control room, that we can have a successful, if scary, landing. So, speaking of faith, let's go ahead and we're going to start out in Hebrews 11. Hebrews 11, where we read about faith. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1 says that faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. Now, the point of the story is that he could not see anything. He could not see the ocean. He could not see the carrier. All he could see was right in front of him, his instrument panel. He can hear his radio, but he knows that the carrier is there, and he trusts the control room, and what they tell him is true. He couldn't see any of these things, but he knows that they're there. And likewise, we don't see God in front of us, but we know that he is there, and we can't see the spiritual forces that are at work around us and inside of us, but we know that they are there. And like him, we need to rely on our training and the tools and the guidance that we are given. In this case, God gives us these things mostly through this book. On top of that, of course, iron sharpens iron, so we receive honing from one another, but it's primarily through his word. And so that's why, I really don't, I think that we can't underestimate the value of the stories and the examples that we read in the Bible and their applicability in our own lives. These people had real lives and they had real problems just like you and I, and we can use their examples to help us. So I want to look at some examples in the Bible of people who seem to be flying blind in a way, and through their hard times they had to do what they knew was right, and they had to trust God to work out the rest for them, the things that they could not see, in order to have a successful landing. So I want to go through several depending on how much time, how fast I can get through them, because just like there are a great many characters and stories in the Bible, again, all real people doing real things, there are all of us here, real people with real problems. And so hopefully, as we go through over a variety of these things, something will strike a chord maybe with you and the problems that you're going through or have been through and learning from, or to prepare you for what God has in your future. All right, so with that in mind, let's go back to Genesis. And our first example is going to be from the life of Abraham. Now, I could probably spend the whole entire message on Abraham, given that there's so much that happens in his life, but I wanted a variety of different perspectives. So we're just going to pick out one episode here, and we're going to go to Genesis chapter 12. Just kind of the beginning of Abraham, now called Abram, and his calling. So Genesis 12, verse 1. We'll start in Genesis chapter 12, in verse 1, where it says, "Now the Lord had said to Abram, 'Get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you, and I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And then Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people whom they had acquired in Haran, and they departed to go to the land of Canaan. And so they came to the land of Canaan. And Abram passed through the land to the place of Shechem, as far as the terebinth tree of Moreh. And the Canaanites were then in the land. And the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your descendants I will give this land. And there he, that is Abram, built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. You see, God was calling Abram because he needed to get out of Ur. He was called to something better than he would achieve if he stayed there. God had something in mind. Abram needed to grow. He needed to build a legacy that God could work with down through time. And none of that was going to happen if he stayed where he was. So to his great credit, Abram listened to God, and he took action. He did something about it. And between that combination of his action and God's direction, it produced results. Now, he didn't know at the beginning exactly where he was going. God told him, head west, and he started. But he trusted that God would get him to where he needed to be. And, you can read further on many different lessons that Abram learns, missteps as well as triumphs. But throughout it all, he's learning that action is most effective when it's wedded with God's will. He's learning firsthand, as we are, what we read about in Proverbs chapter 3, verse 5. Maybe you can flip over there. What does that say? Might be a memory verse for you. Proverbs 3:5 says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. And in all your ways, we heard about walking in the sermonette. As you walk on your way, in all your walking, acknowledge him, and he will direct you. You've got to do something. You've got to go somewhere, but God's going to provide the direction. So maybe as you sit here today, your situation might be similar to Abram's. You need to make a change. You need to get up and go somewhere. Maybe you moved across the country to do something new. And you need to allow God to direct you. I did that. I was living in Kansas City, and I was talking with some friends of mine from church. I'd go over to their house, and we'd, after Sabbath, and we'd eat dinner, watch a movie, and I'd stay up late talking sometimes with them till 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. And they had been to ABC. They're like, oh, you'd love to go to ABC. Like, oh, yeah, maybe one day I'd like to go to ABC. Well, one of the things that was happening in my life at the time was I was working at this mortgage bank, and that was 2008. So that was right at the housing crash. So the bank is going under, and so I'm losing my job. And I get my severance date, and it is literally the day that ABC starts. And so I'm thinking, well, maybe this is direction from God. And so I call my mom and dad, and I say, I really want to go to ABC. And, here's this timing thing and everything, but I don't really have, it's going to cost so much money. I don't really have savings for the upfront costs. I'm sure I can get like a part-time job once I'm there. And they said, well, as it happens, our furnace exploded a few weeks ago, and we got a big insurance payout. New furnace, professional cleaning to get the ash out of the house and all that sort of stuff. And there's exactly the amount that you need for tuition and a little bit extra left over. And if you know my parents, they're on disability, so they literally cannot keep the money or it could affect their benefits. And so they said, we have to spend this money before a certain time. It's yours. Go to Cincinnati. So it's amazing when we allow God to direct us and then we take that step in faith, what he can do. I wound up not only getting to go to ABC, I got married afterwards, and that was kind of the launching pad for a whole new phase in my life, the best phase so far, by far. All right, so that's just one example. Let's go to another example. I'm going to put my ribbon here in Proverbs. We're going to be back here in a few minutes. We're going to go back to Genesis, and we're going to look at someone else who also needed to leave, needed a change, to go somewhere else, but for an entirely different reason. And this is Jacob. Now, whereas Abram needed to leave because God had something in mind for him, Jacob needed to leave because of something he had done. So let's pick up in Genesis 27. Because Jacob needed to get up and get out. Jacob, that is Genesis 27:41. Let's go ahead and pick up here. Now, he had cheated Esau, and so verse 41 in Genesis 27 says, So Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing which his father blessed him. And Esau said in his heart, The days of mourning for my father are at hand, but then I will kill my brother Jacob. And the words of Esau, her older son, were told to Rebekah. So she sent and called Jacob, her younger son, and said to him, Surely your brother Esau comforts himself concerning you by intending to kill you. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice. Arise and flee to my brother Laban in Haran, and stay with him a few days until your brother's fury turns away. So he's running for his life. He made a bad decision, maybe. He's fleeing. He was sneaky and deceitful, so now he's out of here on the run. And what happens as the story goes on is he goes to Laban, who winds up is even sneakier and more deceitful than he is. And he works hard for Laban, just for every time Laban to kind of sneak in and try to steal his wages and pull one over on him, kind of like he did with his brother Esau. And he lives there for 20 years until maybe he finally learns his lesson, which in part is hard work and honesty, unlike where he started out from. And again, Proverbs being the book of wisdom, right after the passage I just read in Proverbs 3, verse 11, Proverbs 3:11 says, My son, do not despise the chastening of the Lord, nor detest his correction. For whom the Lord loves, he corrects, just as a father the son in whom he delights. And Jacob was in need of some correction when he went on the run, and he had 20 years of it, getting a taste of his own medicine, and then some. And this section of Proverbs is quoted in Hebrews 12, and I want to go there real quick, because it adds a little bit that I think is important. Hebrews 12, verse 5 says, And you have forgotten the exhortation which speaks to you as to sons. And it quotes Proverbs. My son, do not despise the chastening of the Lord, nor be discouraged when you are rebuked by him. For whom the Lord loves, he chastens and scourges every son whom he receives. But then continuing on in verse 7, If you endure chastening, God deals with you as with sons. For what son is there whom a father does not chasten? But if you are without chastening, of which all have become partakers, then you are illegitimate and not sons. And furthermore, we have had human fathers who corrected us, and we paid them respect. shall we not much more readily be in subjection to the Father of spirits and live? For they, indeed, for a few days chastened us, as seemed best to them, but he for our profit, that we may be partakers of his holiness. But now no chastening seems to be joyful for the present, but painful. Nevertheless, afterward it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. And I think Jacob learned a lot and ate a lot of that fruit and grew in virtue because of those 20 years of hardship that he had with Laban. And sometimes we're Jacob. We have an episode where we're flying blind. We don't know where we're going to land because of something that we did, some fault that we had. And for a while, things can be pretty up in the air. But through correction and learning and growth, through repentance, a mistake doesn't have to be a crash. If we give it the power to hit the landing zone, we don't have to crash into the ship. But that's only if we're willing to accept the correction and to repent and learn to do better. God can do amazing things with us. We can have a good landing after all, even despite the turbulence. So again, maybe that applies to us right now. Or maybe not. So here's another example. And we'll go back to Genesis. Lots of great stories in Genesis. And look at a man whose life was in turmoil this time, not because of what he did, but because of what other people did. Because sometimes that's where we're at. We didn't do anything wrong, but we still suffer for what other people do. That's not fair, but it's just life. I'm talking about Joseph this time. Because you see, Joseph's father played favorites. And so Joseph's brothers were bitter and resentful. Now, he might have handled it better, but he was a kid, so cut him some slack. Let's pick up in Genesis chapter 39, verse 1. Genesis chapter 39. So this is after his brothers sell him into slavery. Like, he might have been a bit arrogant, but he didn't deserve that. So, Genesis 39. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. But the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all he did to prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight, and served him. And then he made him overseer of his house, and all that he had he put under his authority. And so it was from the time that he had made him overseer of his house, and all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and in the field. And thus he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he did not know what he had except for the bread which he ate. And now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance, and it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph, and she said, "Lie with me." But he refused, and said to his master's wife, "Look, my master doesn't know what is with me in his house, and has committed all that he has to my hand, and there's no one greater in this house than I. Nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you're his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And so it was, as she spoke to Joseph day after day, she wanted him. She spoke to him day after day. That he did not heed her to lie with her or to be with her. So we know the story. So she accuses him of trying to take advantage of her, and she has him thrown in prison. So just when Joseph thinks that he's successfully landed. Everything's going well. He can start to plan for the future in Potiphar's house. He's again flying blind. What is going on? Life is not fair, and he's suffering for something that he didn't do. And he's in prison for years. No doubt wondering what the point of all of this is and what God is doing with him. What does God want from him? But we see, if we keep reading the story, down in verse 21, so now he's in prison. It says, but still there, the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy, and he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever they did there, it was his doing. The keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made to prosper. So despite all these hardships and not knowing exactly how everything would end, Joseph stuck to his guns. He kept practicing the things that he knew. And maybe we have phases like this in our lives, so where we're suffering through no fault of our own. We don't know how things are going to go, what our next step is supposed to be. But we do know the things that we've been taught by God to keep doing, despite of our hardship, to not give up, but to do the things that we know we should do. And if we do these things, then like with Joseph, every time he has these rough patches, he winds up in a better position than he was before. It reminded me of a principle that we find in Colossians. If you want to turn forward to Colossians chapter 3, verse 22. Colossians 3:22, which says, bondservants. Now, this was literally true in Joseph's case. He was a slave at this point in prison. Obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in sincerity of heart, fearing God. And whatever you do, and this is for all of us, do it heartily as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance, for you serve the Lord Christ. But he who does wrong will be repaid for what he has done, and there is no partiality. So despite what we're suffering, wherever we find ourselves in, it's not an excuse to stop doing the right thing, to stop walking, like we heard in the sermonette, in integrity, in love. And if we keep doing these things that we've been trained to do, then our reward comes from God. You might add in your notes Galatians chapter 6, verse 9. Galatians 6:9 says, let us not grow weary while doing good, for in due season we shall reap if we don't lose heart. Like if you're flying, if that pilot had said, this is just too long. He didn't have time. He was going 350 miles an hour. But if he had said, this has been a long flight, I'm just going to forget my training and drift off, it would have been a disaster. So even if we have a long, dark, bumpy flight, we have to keep doing, keep following the training, keep listening to the control room, keep taking that direction. Don't grow weary in well-doing. And God guarantees the successful landing in His time. In His time, which brings me to another example. Back, you guessed it, in Genesis. But don't turn there, because we're not going to turn to Genesis. It talks about him in Genesis, but go instead to Acts, because this is Moses. Like Abraham, the life of Moses has so many different lessons. I could spend a whole entire message there, but I didn't want to do that. So I want to look at just one lesson that we get, and that one is going to be from Stephen's speech about the history of Israel in the book of Acts. Stephen's recounting the history of Israel, and his main point is that the Israelites never seemed to get what God was doing with them, and to give control to God and do things His way, not the way they thought it should be done. So let's jump in and see what he says about Moses in Acts chapter 7. Acts chapter 7, verse 20, starting in verse 20. And Stephen says, "At this time Moses was born and was well-pleasing to God, and he was brought up in his father's house for 3 months. But when he was set out, Pharaoh's daughter took him away and brought him up as her own son. And Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and was mighty in words and deeds. And now when he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. And seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended and avenged him who was oppressed, and struck down the Egyptian. For he supposed that his brethren would have understood that God would deliver them by his hand. But they did not understand." And you know the story after that. He flees for his life into the desert. But Moses believed that he knew what he needed to do. He needed to lead a slave uprising against the Egyptians. But that's not what God had in mind at that time and in that way. His intention was right, but the way he went about it was all wrong, and I think we can all identify with that. There are some times where, like Moses, we have to learn to cope when our expectations have been shattered because we thought that we knew what we were supposed to be doing. We thought we knew it's supposed to be this way, but then it's not. And we're disoriented for a time. We feel like we're flying blind. And Moses goes out into the desert, and I'm sure there was a lot of thinking and a lot of soul searching over his years out there while he's learning to be meek and to serve others. Speaking of that, let's go over to James. Yeah, Epistle of James. Because he talks about this idea of meekness and service. James chapter 3, verse 13. Moses had to learn this the hard way over many years after crashing and burning there and fleeing for his life. James 3:13 says, "Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show by good conduct that his works are done in the meekness of wisdom." In the meekness of wisdom. "But if you have bitter envy and self-seeking in your hearts, do not boast and lie against the truth." That word there, that Greek word there, translated as meekness in the New King James, can be rendered as gentleness. It can be rendered as humility. It's the opposite, as we see here in James. It's the opposite of self-assertiveness, of self-interest. It's learning that you're not in control. We don't have control. God should be the one that's in control. God knows best. And Moses did learn this lesson. He learned it really well. Later on, you can read, he was the most meek person on the face of the earth. And he can tell the other people, he could tell the Israelites while they're waiting for the Red Sea to part and they think they're all going to die, don't be afraid. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. He learned to trust God. He learned that he wasn't in control. He learned to be humble. And God is training all of us in this as well. And that so that we can learn to fly even when we're flying blind. We can trust in Him, trust the directions we're getting from the control room, even in uncertain times and situations. I think we've got time for a couple more examples here. All right, again, because there are so many of us and our situations are all different, it's good to have a variety of examples and role models. So another example that we can look to of someone trusting God when going into a truly terrifying situation is Daniel. So I'll go over to the book of Daniel, chapter 6. Daniel in the lion's den. Daniel 6, verse 1 says, "It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps, to be over the whole kingdom, and over these 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one, that the satraps might give account to them, so that the king would suffer no loss. And then this Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. And so the governors and the satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find no charge or fault, because he was faithful, nor was there any error or fault found in him. And then these men said, 'We shall not find any charge against this Daniel, unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God.' So these governors and satraps thronged before the king, and said thus to him, 'O King Darius, live forever!' All the governors of the kingdom, the administrators and satraps, the counselors and advisers have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree that whoever petitions any god or man for 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. And now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter.' And therefore King Darius was flattered and signed the decree." And of course, what does Daniel do? Verse 10, "And when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home, and in his upper room, with his windows open toward Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since early days." So now he knows he's basically signing his own death warrant. And it's very similar to what we read just a few verses before this with the situation with his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, where they're thrown by Nebuchadnezzar into the giant furnace because they wouldn't bow down to the idol that he set up. And in both cases, they didn't know what was going to happen long term, but they very much knew what was going to happen to them short term. And it was not good. It was very, very bad. And sometimes we're in that, metaphorically, not literally thrown into the lion's den, thankfully, or into the fire. But sometimes we are there too, where we're suffering for doing the right thing, for refusing to compromise. And I think a lot of you probably have stories of this, losing a job because you wouldn't compromise on the Sabbath, because you wanted to take off for the feast or the holy days. Maybe you've lost friends because you wouldn't go along with what they wanted to do. You knew it was sinful. The examples are endless. And, we've got a meal here. Maybe we can share some of these things with each other, strengthen each other on our walk with God. We just need to remember what's spoken of in 1 Peter. We know that in this story, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Daniel, everything turns out all right in the end. Peter speaks to this in his first letter. Let's go to 1 Peter chapter 3. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 14, starting in verse 14. Where he brings this up. He says, even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you are blessed. And do not be afraid of their threats, nor be troubled, but sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you, with meekness and fear, having a good conscience, that when they defame you as evildoers, those who revile your good conduct in Christ may be ashamed. And that's what happened in Daniel's situation. When he was saved from the lion's den, Darius was very sorry that it happened, and he threw the people who plotted against Daniel into the lion's den instead. They were ashamed, and they were also lunch. For it is better, verse 17 here, if it is the will of God, to suffer for doing good than for doing evil. So we know in the end, it's better if we stick to our guns, follow our training, do the right thing, even if we do suffer for it. Let's look at one more Old Testament example. Esther. I was reading this to Ella last night. Esther was given a daunting task that she honestly didn't think that she was up to. And how many people, have you ever been put in a situation where you really weren't sure if it was something you could do? You were afraid that it was too big for you. That's where she was. Sometimes we're presented with a big task that we're not up for. All right, so let's get to Esther chapter 4. Let's read Esther chapter 4 and verse 5. It says, and Esther called Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, whom he had appointed to attend her, and she gave him a command concerning Mordecai to learn what and why this was, because Mordecai's acting weird. She didn't know what was going on yet. And so Hathach went out to Mordecai in the city square that was in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and the sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries to destroy the Jews. And he also gave him a copy of the written decree for their destruction, which was given at Shushan, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, and that he might command her to go in to the king to make supplication to him and plead before him for her people. So Hathach returned and told Esther and the words of Mordecai. And then Esther spoke to Hathach and gave him a command for Mordecai. And she said, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that any man or woman who goes into the inner court to the king who has not been called, he has but one law, put all to death except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter, that he may live. Yet I myself have not been called to go into the king these 30 days. And so he went back to tell Mordecai Esther's words in verse 13. And Mordecai told them to answer Esther, do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet, who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? So Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go, gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan and fast for me, neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day, and my maids and I will fast likewise, and so I will go to the king, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. She didn't think she had it in her. So she fasted to recalibrate. And sometimes we're in that position. We don't know that we're actually up to the task. And so one of the best tools that God gives us for refocusing, for recalibrating, for reconnecting with Him and focusing on what really matters is the tool of fasting. The tool of fasting. We read about this in Isaiah 58. I'll go ahead and read a few verses there. Isaiah 58, verse 6. I won't read the whole chapter. For God says, "Is this not the fast that I have chosen? To loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the heavy burdens, and to let the oppressed go free, and that you break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, and that you bring to your house the poor who are cast out? When you see the naked, that you cover him, and not hide yourself from your own flesh, then your light shall break forth like the morning, and your healing shall spring forth speedily, and your righteousness shall go before you, and the glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. Then you shall call, and the Lord will answer, and you shall cry, and he will say, Here I am." So sometimes we need to recalibrate and see what's really important, to reconnect with God, to shift our focus off of how small we are onto how big God is, and how with Him we can take care of others. We can show that love and concern for others. And if you think about, this is exactly what Esther was doing. It wasn't for her, it was for all of her people that she was willing to do this thing that might get her killed, even though she wasn't sure she was up for it. Again, fasting is an important instrument in our cockpit that can help us reconnect with the tower and refocus on what's really important so that we can make that landing. So we looked at different examples of different tools that we have at our disposal that help us successfully navigate these times when we're not sure where we're going, when we feel like we're flying blind. We talked about having faith as we follow where God is leading. We talked about repentance from our old ways. We talked about diligence and doing right and self-control and humility and patience. We talked about fasting and refocusing on what others need, not just what we're going through. And of course, the Bible is full of many, many other things that I could have picked. But there remains for each and every one of us, even beyond all these things, one final landing, the veil behind which none of us can peer, and a feat that God alone can accomplish for us. After our death, to restore us, to resurrect us, to give us eternal spirit life, we rely solely on Him for this. So let's look at one final example, the ultimate example of trusting God, of letting Him take control as the ultimate landing officer, and that is, of course, Jesus Christ. So let's go to Luke and read about how He listened to His control room, even when it's not what He wanted to hear, but He had faith that it's what needed to happen. Let's go to Luke chapter 22. Luke 22, verse 39. Of course, this is Christ praying in the garden. So it says, "Coming out, He went to the Mount of Olives, as He was accustomed, and His disciples also followed Him. And when they came to the place, to their customary place, He said to them, 'Pray that you may not enter into temptation.' But he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, and he knelt down and prayed, saying, Father, if it is your will, take this cup away from me. He knew he was about to die. He was eternally with God. At his right hand, a spirit being could live forever, but he was going to die. But he says, nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. And an angel appeared to him from heaven, strengthening him. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly. And then his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. Again, he had been with the Father. Down through all time, before time. But now he was going to die, and he had to trust that after 3 days and 3 nights that the Father would resurrect him and restore him back to his throne, to the power that he had given up when he came down as a human. And of course, God was faithful. God did exactly what he had planned to do all along. And if we believe that he was faithful with Jesus Christ, and we know that he'll be faithful with us as well. The last scripture. Let's go to Hebrews chapter 6. And verse 19. Hebrews 6:19. It says, this hope we have as an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast, which enters the presence behind the veil, where the forerunner has entered for us, even Jesus, having become high priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. If God can do it for him, he has promised to do it for us as well, the final landing, the ultimate landing. So while we wait for that, we've got many training flights in our lives. And sometimes it'll feel like we're flying blind. And try as we might, we'll struggle to see what's around us, what's underneath us, how we're going to land, what's the correct path forward. But even as we struggle to see, we know that God sees us. He knows where we are. He knows if we're on the right approach. He knows what we need for a successful landing. And just like the pilot in the story that I started out with, who had a hair-raising experience, but he made it. We have to have faith that if we follow our training, if we use the tools that we're given, and if we follow the direction from our control room, then we can also be confident that we can have many successful landings.